Thank you very much. So as you mentioned, I actually titled this presentation "Rethinking InfoSec." It's basically a combination of ideas that I like to present to the information security industry and practitioners about how we could maybe do things differently. So I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Greg van der Gaast. I've been doing this for 23 years. My phone provider still lets me have the under 30 plan because they don't realize how old I am. I started out
Greg, can you hear me? Sorry, can you?
Yes.
We do see a window in the middle of your presentation. Can you do something about it?
Apologies. It's my preview window, which is going into the main window.
Oh, all right, that's much better. Thank you.
Right. Sorry about that. So yes, I started out as a teenage hacker, as you mentioned. Basically, what happened is I think I was 15 or 16 years old, and I saw the movie Hackers. And there were some hackers in there, and he wound up with Angelina Jolie, so I thought this is something I should investigate. And I Yahoo'd, because Google didn't exist yet, hacking, and I learned about Linux and operating systems and downloaded them. And about a year later, I was part of this group of teenage hackers called the Millworm, and yes, we did end up hacking a nuclear weapons facility. Not very long after they did some live atomic tests, so there was even the United Nations Security Council talking about us, which was quite interesting. Not too long after that, I moved to the United States, and I was visited by some men in suits. These men in suits from the Defense Department and the FBI, they made me a job offer that I couldn't refuse. They were quite specific about the couldn't refuse part of this job offer. And I spent the next 3 years working undercover for the government. And the biggest takeaway there was in addition to the breaches I may have caused earlier on, I was exposed to a lot of breaches. And I saw, it was quite interesting to observe what actually led to the breaches, because you had a lot of organizations with a lot of security spending, security programs, security accreditations, but they were still getting breached. And that shaped my thinking about how to secure things a lot. After 9/11, I was being asked to do more interesting stuff that was a little bit too interesting for me. So I went off and I worked for NATO for a little bit. I did the in-field communications networks for Kosovo and Afghanistan. I became the head of security architecture for CGI, which is Canada's largest MSP. I worked for a number of startups as well. And I went into contracting for a while. And this is where I did the usual thing of writing policies and getting companies ISO compliant and implementing in firewalls and intrusion detection and other security technologies. And it is by far the most money I've ever made in my life. It was ridiculous. And in hindsight, it was also the lowest value security work I've ever done. Later on, at some point, I was put in charge of creating a global security framework for a Fortune 500 company. And that's what I realized. I need to actually create something that's going to work because I'm responsible for it. And started kind of making these clean sheet information security programs, which is something that I advocate and I train other people. As you said, I'm the author of a book called Rethinking InfoSec, which has some concept that we'll hint on about here. And I'm quite well known as being absolutely fanatical about being proactive and engaging the business to really make information security that works. So I just want to set the stage about information security today. We see a lot of adoption of detection tooling. We need more and more staff. We have the cybersecurity skills gap. There's more pressure on the skills market. The salaries are increasing. We just can't find the people. So we talk a lot about automation. As I think the previous presentation hinted, the stress levels are increasing. I can certainly vouch for that. And yet the number of incidents is increasing, and the scale of incidents is increasing. And I've taken this graph here, and there are many, many more that you can find like it with Google. And in blue, you see the increase in security spending. Now, what's interesting is it's not just increasing in absolute terms, but it's increasing in terms of percentage of IT budget and total company budgets, which is not sustainable. We cannot just keep spending a higher percentage of the company's resources towards security, especially when the net effect is not a decrease in how much money we're losing to breaches. The losses are actually running away from us. So clearly something about the approach isn't working. And the industry's solution to this is spend more money, do more of it until it works. And that's quite profitable, but not necessarily good if you actually want to create assurance. And why is this happening? So one of the analogies I use is the car factory. So imagine you're standing on the street. I understand you're in Germany, so you have several excellent car factories to choose from in this analogy. And imagine you see sheet metal going into the factory and all the parts, and the sheet metal gets stamped into body shells, and all the engines and transmissions and interiors and suspension, everything gets bolted on the assembly line. And then the cars get pushed into the parking lot. However, they get pushed from the third floor. So all these beautiful, shiny, perfect cars crash into the parking lot, all smashed to bits. And then the people in the parking lot, like, quick, move it aside because more cars are coming. Squish, squish, squish. And for each of these cars, they set them aside. They create a workspace. They assess it. They determine what's the damage, what part needs to be replaced, what's the procedure, the order of dismantling, of fixing this part, what tools do we need for that, how do we prioritize the repairs, how do we make it so we're not stepping all over each other, what tools do we need, let's create a quality management framework to make sure that we're doing all this right. Let's get some vendors in and some consultants to maybe teach us better ways of doing this or sell us better tools. And before you know it, you have this incredibly sophisticated, mature industry in this parking lot, employing tens of thousands of highly skilled technical workers. And that's my analogy for the security industry. And the interesting thing is, very few people are actually taking a step back and wondering, well, why don't we just fix the assembly line? So I think what we need is fewer of these highly technical skills and more kind of fresh eyes to look at the problem. Because we talk a lot about diversity, so at least in the UK, we talk a lot about diversity in information security. But the fact is, you could have the most wonderful, colorful, multi-ethnic background in the world, but then we tell you exactly how to work. We indoctrinate you before we'll give you a job in security to work exactly like us. And one of the successes I've had, and this is mentioned in the book, is people that everyone say do not have the skills to do security or are not qualified, I hire them. Because I can take a 10-year CISA, CISSP veteran who costs me 100,000 euros per year, put him on the ground, and the first thing he's going to do is hit the ground running, run straight to the car and start changing radiators. But I can take a 21-year-old, straight out of university, zero education, zero knowledge of cyber, and the first question he asks me is, why are we throwing the cars down from the third floor? And that's why strategically, a fresh perspective can be a lot more valuable than the way we're currently doing things. And one thing that interests me a lot is this highly sophisticated cyber attacks that we keep hearing about. This is a headline, I think it was the Daily Mail newspaper here in the UK. So again, another highly sophisticated cyber attack. And when I first saw this, I jokingly said, I bet you it's SQL injection from 1998. It was SQL injection from 1998. There's nothing sophisticated about most of these attacks. Some of the ways in which they're monetized or exploited, or the techniques to escalate privilege or move around or to leverage the breach have changed. But the actual ways of getting that initial foothold, the actual thing that starts that kill chain, as we call it, tends to be the really simple stuff. It's a lack of asset management, a lack of patching, it's poor software provisioning, poor access rights, poor code review, no architectural standards, very simple stuff. The key to doing security well is not incredibly sophisticated next-gen AI, blockchain, whatever. It's do the basics well. Do the basics holistically and sustainably so that you have a wall that goes all around the village, has no gaps in it, and is maintained at that level. It only needs to be about 1.5 meters high, and you'll keep everyone out. Because that's a lot more effective than building one that's 100 meters high, but only has gaps in it, or only covers half the village. And what you need for that holistic approach is a level of care and engagement and curiosity and proactivity that we don't see very often. Because more and more we're becoming a very technical discipline, very SecOps, very after the fact, very detect and respond. And we like to hide in our big dark room with all the monitors in it, which is fantastic when the World Cup is on, but in terms of security is not that effective. So an example I give is when I was a teenage hacker, I would wake up in the morning, well, around noon, pour myself a bowl of Cocoa Puffs, and build myself a machine, load up OpenBSD or Linux or FreeBSD, harden it, patch it, and then I would dial up onto the internet and go into internet chat rooms full of hackers. Now, I had a public IP address directly on my system. I had no EDR, I had no firewall, I had no anti-malware, I had absolutely nothing. And I would antagonize all these hackers, and I would see them connecting to my system and trying everything they could, and nothing happened. I had no security technologies at all, and yet the system was inherently secure because it was built properly. And that, to me, is what real assurance, what security should be about, instead of trying to do things further downstream and catch the things that only happen because we didn't bother truly securing the system. We talk a lot about resilience nowadays, but it doesn't actually mean resilience, because we use the word resilience as recovery, which means you weren't resilient, you're recovering from something. And that, I think, is a real issue. We have to understand how things actually work, and we have to get involved upstream to actually fix these processes. Now, I'll skip this because I know we're tight on time, but we know you can scale the system. I understand that it's more complicated now and there's more dimensions. It's not just tech anymore either. It's not just the machine, the network, more machines, servers, all that stuff. There are business aspects, there are political aspects, there are cultural aspects, there are human aspects, but you can scale it. But it requires understanding your organization, understanding what people do. Instead of going through a checklist on ISO or NIST, go through your org chart. Find out what people do. Where is the data? Who uses it? What systems are involved? And build your protection. Build a framework around protecting that. You can map it to ISO later on. It'll be very, very easy, actually. But it's very important to get engaged and build the relationships within your business to actually know what's going on. And that's where the fanatical engagement comes in. The real proactivity, helping people, caring, showing interest, having people become your eyes and ears, building relationships, have the traction to get involved in things. Do what's valuable for you and not just the best practices. If you build security into your business, it will always be there, as opposed to if you build security afterwards and try to bolt it on, it'll be the first thing that falls off. We'll talk about the importance of ownership and what I mean by that in a couple of slides. So one saying I hear a lot is you have to get it right every single time. We do this all the time, and the attackers only have to get it right once. Well, this is why it's actually so important to be holistic and sustainable, as opposed to throwing a bunch of SecOps detect and respond resource at problems, because most of these organizations that get breached, many of them will have spent tens, even hundreds of millions of dollars or pounds or euros in security operations, but they'll be compromised because they missed a machine, because they didn't have good asset management, or there was a machine that didn't get patched, or there was a machine that couldn't get patched because there was no architectural standard when it was created, and now it's unmaintainable. There's a Sun Tzu expression that says, know thyself, know thy enemy, 1,000 battles, 1,000 victories, which is simply, if you know what's out there and you know what you have, you know how to protect it, and you'll be fine. And the reality is, if you look at the other way around, if you secure a vulnerability, if you eliminate the existence of that vulnerability, that will foil 1 billion of the enemy's attacks against that vulnerability. So we have that home field advantage, but we're not leveraging it. You often hear that the attackers know our network better than we do, and that's telling, because we're actually there. We should know more than the person outside. We're not exercising enough engagement to get that knowledge that allows us to then protect it in a holistic fashion. And I'm bouncing from side to side a bit, but one thing that I think is very important to mention is culture. Underneath it all, we like to talk about tech and make security sound like it's about tech, but ultimately it's about culture. And we tend to appropriate words in security. I don't mean user awareness when I say culture. I mean leadership culture, a culture of care, a culture of engagement, a culture of altruism. These are very important things. So on the left is a bar diagram. It's not the actual bar diagram I got, but it was something very similar to it when I started a new role. And it was a maturity assessment. There's 12 areas, and this is how our maturity has been rated by an outside assessment firm. And I immediately told them, there's some good areas, some poor areas. I told them, no, I don't believe this graph. I think your average maturity is about a 1 or a 2, something like that. And they said, well, no, that's not possible because look, we have 8s, we have 10s, we have 7s. If you do the math, we're about a 5.5 or a 6. And I said, that's simply not possible. Simply because an organization that scores a 10, that has that level of care and engagement to do something to absolute perfection, there is no way that in another area they'll do a terrible job of a 1 out of 10. It just doesn't happen. Culture tends to be something very consistent. And sometimes I don't have the opportunity to see, like with a third-party provider, I don't have visibility to everything they do. But if I can tell that their people are being attentive in 1 or 2 areas, it's reasonably certain that they will be attentive across the board. And sure enough, on the right, a year later, once we had better visibility, same organization, you can see how consistent the maturity is across the silos. So where they were seeing 10s, it was simply because they hadn't dug deep enough and they didn't realize what the underlying issues were. And this also goes to show to me that most security metrics are terrible because they're full of arbitrary bias and they're based on knowns and misconceptions and half-truths, and you're just lacking visibility. It's very, very important to both understand the technical details, but understand that culture ties them all together. Now, earlier I mentioned ownership, and ownership is something, I'm going to rush through this now. Imagine my apartment's constantly getting flooded and my floors are ruined. Now, this is obviously my problem, but we in security often argue, well, that's not our problem because it's coming from upstairs. And we then say we're powerless to fix it because it's coming from upstairs. And you're right. But instead of hiring 1,000 people to sit in my apartment with buckets of water trying to catch the water coming whenever it comes, I could just go upstairs and talk to them, maybe buy them a nice bottle of red wine. And if I have to, I'll pay for their plumber to fix their pipes, just so that I don't have to deal with the issues downstream. And this is something that we tend to buy more and more security solutions to address gaps in business process and IT process. My last role, 95% of the security spending went to IT operations to help them optimize how they worked, so there were fewer gaps and fewer security issues for us to deal with. So it's really to take that ownership of a problem, even if it's not officially our problem, because the end goal is not to spend the company's money, it's to save money, to do the best thing for everyone. Strategic importance, everyone's trying to fight fires. And instead, I think people need to realize that everything in your environment slides over time. After 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, all of it will be gone. And you can fight fires with what you have on the table, or you can try to fix the pipeline to make sure that everything that comes out of the pipeline is in good condition. And everything that comes out of it will then slowly over time displace everything else. Because everything you're fixing right now that's already in your environment will be gone in 5 years anyway, probably. So always fix the pipeline. And the analogy I always use is, the village at the base of the dam is flooding, and people are taking their televisions downstairs and bring them upstairs. But the dam is going to break tomorrow, and the entire village is going to be lost. So forget the TV, let the TV get ruined, and go to the dam and fix the dam. And this is very important in terms of prioritizing. I'm a little bit short on time, so I'm rushing here. Apologies. So the end game for me is holistic and sustainable assurance. Like I'm back to the analogy of walls. It has to be consistent. It has to be all the way around. And you really have to focus on doing things